John Ashworth was a preacher and writer who lived in Rochdale in the 1800s. We begin this trail at St Clement's Church in Spotland in Rochdale. Some of the people from John Ashworth's strange tales were buried here at St Clement's. Niff from Niff and His Dogs was buried here. Niff was buried only a few yards from the spot where John Ashworth spoke to him, with his 3 trail dogs, as described in the tale. When Niff died in 1878, an inquest took place at the Church Inn, which used to be here. Some of the other people who are buried here include Abraham Lord, also known as Old Abe, James Wolfenden from My New Friends, Old Adam Schofield, Old Matthew Shepherd, and Robert Leach from The Lost Curl. A stonemason called James Wolfenden lived here at Spotland Bridge. He scoffed at and mocked the Bible, but he turned from sin towards God. And John Ashworth said Wolfenden became one of the happiest men he'd ever met with. On the 27th of December 1868, John Ashworth was leading a service at a new school here near the junction of Clark's Lane and Mitchell Street. During the service, a raging storm lifted the roof and 3 walls fell in. The roof came down and 37 people were hurt, but nobody was killed. Mr. Ashworth visited some of the wounded the next day. He said, "How I escaped, I cannot tell. It is amazing none were killed on the spot." John Ashworth knew an old Christian man called Matthew Shepherd. One day old Matthew took a walk up Falinge Road. He listened to the birds singing because of how happy they were. He said, "If God feeds them, he'll feed me, that's certain." Old Matthew cried for joy and sang and cried for gladness because of the goodness of God. An aged couple called John and Mary Howarth lived in a humble cellar at 17 Falinge Road. John and Mary started going to John Ashworth's Chapel for the Destitute. They began a weekly prayer meeting in their humble cellar. John and Mary's cellar was probably opposite where Hebron Pentecostal Church is now. Old Matthew Shepherd lived at 42 Toad Lane. Old Matthew was a weaver and lived in great poverty. He said, "We cannot be poor if we have Christ, and we cannot be rich without him." As a young man, John Ashworth sometimes went to Providence Chapel on High Street. When he was a boy, John Ashworth went to a free school here on Red Cross Street. Donkey cart driver James Clough lived at 10 Wilson Street. Clough was a terrible drunkard and swearer, but he was converted, and he began to live a life of faith in Jesus Christ. He said his donkey felt the benefit because he didn't beat it anymore. There was a prison here known as Rochdale Lockup. John Ashworth mentions the prison a number of times in his strange tales. Wardleworth Workhouse was also situated here. 4 years after John Ashworth's death, Wardleworth Workhouse became the Ashworth Chapel for the Destitute, and was used as such until 1902, when a new chapel was built next to it. When King George IV was crowned in 1821, John Ashworth, then a young boy, was given a new shilling and a medal, and told to wear the medal here at St Mary's the following Sunday. In one of his strange tales, John Ashworth describes how John Wesley arrived on horseback to preach in Rochdale in the 1700s. He went to a public house called the Old Clock Face, and stabled his horse in a place near here called White Bear Yard. The College Bank Flats were named after buildings which stood in a slum estate here. John Ashworth wrote about a young man called Philip who lived at Dunkirk House. Philip knew he was dying, and he knew he was going to his Saviour. He was a lonely lad with no relations or friends. He asked John Ashworth to go to his funeral and to carry him to his grave when he died. An old woman called Martha also lived at Dunkirk. Martha was very poor and was afflicted with asthma, but she blessed God for his goodness. There was a row of houses here called Gibson Row. Lawrence and Peggy Hoyle lived at 210 Gibson Row. Lawrence Hoyle and another man, Joseph Taylor, both came to know God when they were over 80 years old. John Ashworth wrote a tale about them called A Wonder, or The Two Old Men. This is where Bridge Mill used to be. A Christian man called William Heap refused to work at the mill on a Sunday. The mill owner worked on the Sunday, and a cart of his goods crashed into the river. John Ashworth said the mill owner's wealth diminished, while William Heap's prospered because he kept the Sabbath. John Ashworth knew a poor old Christian man called James Lord. One day he saw James Lord here, and while they were talking, a rich and ungodly man went by in an expensive horse-drawn carriage. Although he worked hard and got little more than bread and water, old James Lord said he trusted in God's providence. When he was a boy, John Ashworth had a friend called James Farrow. James found out his father George was to be executed for robbery. On the day James found out, his mother took the two boys home from school. They went through the fields to avoid seeing people on the highway. They went past Oakenrod, Coptrod, and the pits. John Ashworth sat down with James and his mother on the top of a brow behind a farmhouse here at Pitts, and they all wept till it was dark. James's mother took the two boys by the hands and said to them, "My dear boys, never be idle, never steal. Pray to God to make you honest and good.